Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today I'm finishing up with part 5 of World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution series, and I think I'm just going to leave it at this one. I know you guys are getting a bit tired of Dr. Jeff, and well, so am I. I try really hard not to throw personal insults around, but the more I watch of Dr. Jeff, the harder this becomes as I think of more funny comparisons that I could make and then get sad that I won't be able to share them with you. For example, he looks like the word moist took human form but hasn't quite figured out the whole blinking thing yet. Now, I may watch through the rest of them myself to see if there's anything worth responding to in the future, but this is the official end of this series. So let's go!
Now, that said, certain genetic similarities should be completely expected given similar body structures, physiologies, biochemistries, intended diets.
If you'll recall from last time, this was his follow-up to his pointing out that organisms that are extremely different from each other, such as tobacco plants and chimps, have the same number of chromosomes. Therefore, evolutionists should consider them to be closely related because the numbers of chromosomes match up. This, of course, completely ignores what is contained within the chromosomes, and now he's bringing up the genetic similarities that most organisms share because they are responsible for some of the most basic functioning of the cell. And yes, it would be expected that genetic similarities would be responsible for these similar structures and functions. But if there's one thing that a study of homology and analogy can teach us, it's that there are a myriad of different ways that genetic material can accomplish the same task. So there really isn't any reason for similar structures or functions to share genetic material outside of an evolutionary relationship. Because when they do happen independently outside of their evolutionary relationship, the genetic material is inevitably different. And you can trace the relationship of specific genes through the evolutionary tree using small differences in the genetic codes to map out the relationships. And when you do this, independently, for several different genes, the tree of relationship matches up quite closely, leading to the conclusion that it is an accurate depiction of the relationship. If God had created everything independently, he could easily have scattered these different variations throughout his creation in a way that didn't have them all matching up in a big tree of relationship. But no, he apparently wanted to trick us into developing the theory of evolution some 6,000 years after he created everything.
Humans and chimps are both mammals and have similar types of internal organs. We both eat fruits and vegetables, which means our mouths and digestive systems will have some similar characteristics. We both have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, fingers. We get sensory information from these body structures.
Here's the thing, though. God didn't have to create the other great apes. He could have made another organism that is wholly and obviously not related to humans to fill the same ecological niche as the other great apes. But instead, he made ones that look like us, act like us, and when analyzed both genetically and morphologically, appear to be very closely related to us. He could have made all the great apes except for humans marsupials, which would then have thrown a massive wrench into the phylogenies. He could have made humans in a way that doesn't fit us perfectly in the great ape category. There are a number of things that he could have done to make it obvious that humans are not actually related to the other animals, but he didn't do it that way. He deceptively made everything appear to be related, and then expected us not to believe it when we eventually found the evidence of these relationships.
So there's no doubt that there will be many similarities between human and chimp DNA.
Yes, many similarities, and slightly fewer similarities between humans and gorillas. And actually, humans and chimps are more closely related to each other than either is to the gorilla. And when you map out these genetic relationships, you get a phylogeny that is, within a reasonable margin for error, identical to a phylogeny that you'd get by mapping out these relationships through morphology, or by tracing endogenous retroviruses, or a bunch of different other methods. These independent methods of tracing relationships didn't have to match up, but they do. Evolution is the most parsimonious explanation for this fact.
If a person contends that genetic similarities prove we evolved from a common ancestor, problems and inconsistencies abound, as we've seen.
I mean, I have seen plenty of problems and inconsistencies with your explanation of genetics. The main problem I see when researching actual genetic studies is that genes are really complicated little things that, even when well understood, can still throw us curveballs. This is due, in part, to the fact that genetic material does not act like a blueprint or computer code, with one gene always producing the same result regardless of anything else. Because DNA is a chemical, the chemical makeup of the cell in which the genetic material is housed, as well as its neighbors, will have an effect on how the gene ends up working. So you can't just look at a string of letters and determine from nothing but those letters what that gene will do. You have to know what environment those letters are going to be working in. But I wouldn't really expect Dr. Jeff to understand that, what with his demonstration of a complete lack of understanding about how anything works in genetics.
The evolutionary model is not in harmony with the evidence. It's not the reasonable scientific choice. It's a biased choice, a choice which typically starts with a baseless assumption, a rejection of all non-natural possibilities for the origin of the universe.
Not at all. Now, personally, yes, I do reject non-natural explanations for the origin of the universe, but I know plenty of people who accept evolution because that's where the evidence points, but believe that the universe was created by a god or gods. What I think about the origin of the universe is completely 100% irrelevant to the theory of evolution. The universe is here. Why? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that evolution happens in the universe that is here. Does accepting evolution necessarily exclude the supernatural from being an explanation for the universe? No, it does not. Creationists would do well to stop proposing that it does.
What about horse evolution? Hasn't that been documented in the fossil record? It's definitely been taught as such in biology textbooks for decades.
I'm going to make a prediction here. Now, I have not watched this part of his video yet, but I predict that at some point, he is going to bring up that quote from George Gaylord Simpson that is about how the linear evolution picture that is usually presented with regards to horses is not representative of how horses actually evolved.
Supposedly, the modern horse, known as Equus, has been documented as evolving from the small fox-like creature known as Hyracotherium, or the Eohippus.
If you're oversimplifying it, yes, basically. But in reality, this is the same as every other evolutionary relationship from the fossil record. We don't know for certain if Hyracotherium is actually the direct ancestor of modern horses, or if some other species that was closely related to and existed at the same time as Hyracotherium was the actual direct ancestor. But Hyracotherium is in the horse family tree. There is no question about that. It's just a question of placement.
John Rennie, writing in the prominent science magazine Scientific American in 2002, in an article titled 15 Answers to Creationist Nonsense, he said, "Actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. A sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus."
He gave it a really weird inflection there, but that is actually the end of the sentence. But that single sentence about Eohippus was pulled from the answer to number 13. Evolutionists cannot point to any transitional fossils, creatures that are half reptile, half bird, for instance. So that paragraph is not speaking specifically about the evolutionary history of the horse. It is just listing a bunch of transitional forms. So yeah, this popular science publication, when giving a quick list of known transitional forms, did not go into specific detail about the fact that we can't know for certain which species known only from fossils was the actual ancestor of an extant species.
So evolutionists tout horse evolution charts as decisive evidence of evolution. The problem is that evolutionists themselves, the ones in the know, long ago abandoned horse evolution as an example of transitional forms.
Oh, I feel it coming. That George Gaylord Simpson quote, it's right around the corner. I know it.
They're realizing that the evidence for a gradual evolutionary progression isn't even available. And so they've decided they really need another theory. They're now moving towards the belief that evolution is less of this straightforward progression and more like maybe a bush with many varying branches.
Yes, that was a shift in the scientific viewpoint that happened decades ago. A shift that was largely spearheaded by George Gaylord Simpson. We're so close, don't leave me hanging.
But that hardly fixes the problem with the theory. Actually, it makes it worse, since there's even more transitional fossils that need to be found to link species with their common ancestors.
It actually makes it slightly easier, as there are several cousin species that do well enough to fill the gaps of approximately what the transition would have looked like. A husky and a wolf are different species, but they are close enough that, thousands to millions of years from now, when looking at the descendants of the canids, a husky or a wolf would both be a good enough representation of their ancestry from our time period. Only one would be the actual ancestor, but both are close enough that you could still get a picture of what the ancestor looked like, even if you can't say for certain which one it is.
David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago.
Oh, fuck you. I want my George Gaylord Simpson!
He admitted 30 years ago Well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic.
Yeah, it's not a linear progression. That's one of the most basic things you learn about the theory of evolution nowadays. It was once thought to be at least somewhat linear, but we have since learned better. This is yet another case of science making progress, and creation is pointing to that progress and complaining that it's changed, so scientists must not know what they're really talking about since science changes all the time.
In other words, there's no evidence of transitional creatures linking various kinds in the fossil record.
Did you not listen to yourself while reading that quote? That is not what was said at all. He said that we have had to modify our understanding of certain evolutionary progressions based on an accumulation of more detailed information. The horse transition was modified. Now he also mentioned discarding some. I'm not sure which ones were discarded, but the horse one was not. It was modified. In that particular publication, Dr. Raup was discussing whether or not natural selection is a strong enough mechanism to account for all of the change that we see in the fossil record. To continue on in the next paragraph after your quote, now let me take a step back from the problem and very generally discuss natural selection and what we know about it. I think it is safe to say that we know for sure that natural selection as a process does work. There is a mountain of experimental and observational evidence, much of it predating genetics, which shows that natural selection as a biological process works. And then a little later when discussing the fossil record, now with regard to the fossil record, we certainly see change. If any of us were to be put down in the Cretaceous landscape, we would immediately recognize the difference. Some of the plants and animals would be familiar, but most would have changed and some of the types would be totally different from those living today. This record of change pretty clearly demonstrates that evolution has occurred if we define evolution simply as change, but it does not tell us how this change took place, and that is really the question. And it goes even deeper than that. You see, Dr. Raup specialized in extinction events. So when he expressed doubts about natural selection, it was not that he doubted natural selection's ability to lead to great diversity, it was that he doubted that natural selection could account for the great extinction events that weren't as well documented at that time, each of which would have had a profound effect on the ecology of the planet.
The famous paleontologist of Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson, way back in 1953, he summed the truth up when he said, "The uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature."
Oh, that felt so good. Thanks for finally getting me there. Okay, so when I went over this in a previous video, I wasn't able to track down the original source for that quote. This time, though, I found it. So last time, I essentially just used Simpson's reputation as being a key figure in the shift in thought away from the idea of goal-oriented directed evolution to interpret that quote. And I was right. That is exactly what this quote is about. It's followed up in his book with several examples where the evolution of the horse, when traced, shows several offshoots and branches with features that didn't make it to the modern horse. He then goes on to say that the evolution of the horse family, Equidae, is now no better known than that of numerous other groups of organisms, but it is still a classic example of evolution in action, and a very instructive example when correctly presented. Also, for what it's worth, he did give an illustration of the evolution of the horse foot, and included a couple of side branches to illustrate the fact that the development of the horse was not trying to get to a modern horse, but was experimenting with the different designs to see which would work. And of course, as probably needs saying here before creationists jump on the language I use to describe that, it's not that there is some force behind evolution doing the experimenting. That's just referring to genetic diversity plus natural selection. The genes just make a bunch of stuff, and they mutate randomly, which can be likened to trying different combinations of things. It's sad that this needs clarifying, but here we are.
So some evolutionists proceed to counter with whale evolution.
No, we counter with the fact that you took his quote completely out of context, and horse evolution is still well documented. And, as pointed out by Dr. Simpson, we have plenty of other organisms whose evolutionary history is at least as well documented as that of the horse. The horse just remains one of the classic examples. But yes, whale evolution is another excellent example of evolution in action in the fossil record.
Yeah, well, whale evolution is still well documented, though, so horse evolution is irrelevant anyway.
No, horse evolution is still entirely relevant. It's just not as straightforward as one of those pictures of it would have you believe if that were all you ever learned on the subject.
According to evolutionists, whale evolution is well-documented proof of Darwinian evolution.
Yep, it sure is. I mean, I could quibble with your use of the word proof, because anytime I don't, people mention it in the comments about how proof is only acceptable in math. But yeah, our documentation of cetacean evolution is excellent evidence for evolution.
Supposedly, in this well-documented story, whales evolved from mammals that lived on land and that supposedly gradually moved into the water in search of food.
Well, I don't know about the in search of food part, but yes, whales developed from land animals that gradually became more aquatic for one reason or another. Food may or may not have been one of the reasons for that.
In a 2007 edition of Nature magazine, J.G.M. Thewison, who's an evolutionary anatomist and professor at Northeast Ohio Medical University, he claimed to have found the oldest and closest relative of the whale. Now here's the problem. For many years, the hippopotamus was considered to be the closest whale relative.
Hippos are possibly the closest living relative to whales, yes, but you just said that Thewison found the oldest and closest relative to whales, which itself is a bit of a nonsensical statement. I mean, would anyone be tempted to state that their great-great-great-grandmother, who died years and years before they were born, is their closest relative? And oldest relative doesn't make sense in this context either. The oldest relative of the whale is the last universal common ancestor, and maybe not even that. It might be something earlier. Are we really supposed to trust this guy to dismantle over a century of science when he can't even parse out the correct meanings of oldest and closest?
Now remember, the evolution of whales is supposedly one of the most well-documented proofs of evolution. Clearly that means nothing. If the evolution of whales is one of the best documented proofs of evolution, then all of their proofs should be called into question by the scientific community. Because Thewison claims that the evolutionary community needs to totally revamp its entire theory about whale evolution. Supposedly Indohyus, a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of a raccoon, should now be considered the closest relative of the whale, a creature that looks like the African mouse deer. Now, if whale evolution has been so well documented, as evolutionists claim, how can such a major switch be made, seemingly at the drop of a hat, as though it's no big deal? Changing from the hippo as the closest ancestor to a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon, they surely can't be as confident about their theories as they led on if such a change can be considered legitimate.
Do you really have such a poor understanding of the subject? There's a huge difference between closest living relative and ancestral lineage. Now, hippos have been used as a basis for comparison with what might have been the ancestor to the whale lineage, but to the best of my knowledge, it has never been proposed that whales evolved from hippos. And actually, this is one of those moments when we see the theory of evolution being used to make predictions. In 1883, William Henry Flower described how he thought whales would have developed. We may conclude by picturing to ourselves some primitive, generalized marsh-haunting animals with scanty covering of hair like the modern hippopotamus, but with broad, swimming tails and short limbs, omnivorous in their mode of feeding, probably combining water plants with mussels, worms, and freshwater crustaceans, gradually becoming more and more adapted to fill the void place ready for them on the aquatic side of the borderland on which they dwelt, and so by degree being modified into dolphin-like creatures inhabiting lakes and rivers and ultimately finding their way into the ocean. He had some of the details wrong, but he was incredibly close to describing the transition, the fossils of which weren't discovered for about another century after he made his prediction. And it can go even deeper than that. John Hunter noted in the 1700s that there are numerous points in the visceral organs of the cetacea which far more resemble those of the ungulata than those of the carnivora. In other words, in the 1700s, John Hunter was able to point out that cetaceans appeared to be more closely related to the ungulates than to the carnivores. And yes, hippos are ungulates, and they are likely the closest living relative to modern cetaceans. But nobody that I'm aware of has ever thought that hippos were the ancestors to cetaceans. At best, they were used as a starting point for comparison when describing what the ancestor of cetaceans would have looked like.
Now again, in this supposedly well-documented evolutionary story, whales evolved from land-living mammals that gradually moved into water in search of fish and water-dwelling prey. But now, according to Thewison, it seems that the mammals that gradually moved into the water in search of prey were not carnivores at all. He says, quote, "Clearly this is not the case. Indohyus is a plant eater and already is aquatic. Apparently the dietary shift to hunting animals, as modern whales do, came later than the habitat shift to the water."
Yeah, sure. We're not tied to any one specific explanation of why they may have made their move to the water. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter much. It would be fascinating to find out for sure, but the fact is that they moved to the water. Now, why would that be if it weren't for a food source? Do we have any evidence of any land-dwelling creature that might make extended visits to the water for reasons other than hunting food? It would be helpful if we could find an example of a deer-like animal that did that, since, the Indohyus is described as deer-like. Oh, but what is this? The article that you pulled that quote from recommends watching a YouTube video? And that YouTube video is of a deer-like creature that lives on land but can spend extended periods of time in water walking along the bottom to avoid predators? But it's not hunting fish, so clearly it has no reason to be in the water, right?
So with the discovery of one deer-like fossil, the whole alleged evolution of whales is swept aside.
No, the discovery of one deer-like fossil caused us to rethink the reason that whale ancestors had for moving into the water, an incredibly minor modification to our picture of whale evolution.
Whales didn't evolve from land-dwelling ancestors in search of food. Their ancestors were supposedly already in the water and were herbivores, not carnivores.
You didn't really read the article that you pulled that quote from, did you? It makes it quite clear that Indohyus was an aquatic wading animal. That is, it spent much of its time in the water, but it did spend some of its time on the land, like modern hippos do. So, no, we haven't found the ancestor of whales that was 100% terrestrial, but we do have plenty of transitions from semi-aquatic to fully aquatic, giving us an excellent picture of how whales evolved.
Not the hippo, a raccoon-sized mouse deer-looking creature. That's some pretty big changes.
What an idiot.
It seems abundantly clear that the evolutionist case is not as well documented as they pretend.
No, it's quite well documented. You just seem entirely incapable of understanding the difference between ancestor and closest living relative. Now, to be fair, the Science Daily article that you linked to did have a poorly phrased summary that described Indohyus as the closest known fossil relative of whales. I think they meant closest to the whale's land-dwelling ancestor rather than closest to modern whales, but as I said, it was poorly phrased. But you also had to be trying pretty hard to misunderstand it in order to get to the conclusion that you ended up reaching.
Now consider this. What do you suppose links the Indohyus to the whale? What was so significant about this find that made Thewison want to change the evolutionary lineage of the whale?
Well, how about we read the article that you quoted from to find out? Dr. Thewison and colleagues report key similarities between whales and Indohyus in the skull and ear that show their close family relationship. It's literally the third paragraph, and these paragraphs are not very long or technical. If you want a technical answer, perhaps consider going to the original research paper rather than relying on Science Daily to summarize it for you. I mean, you don't even have to go past the abstract to get to which details they use to place Indohyus in the cetacean lineage. We've got the structure of its ears and premolars, the density of its limb bones, and the stable oxygen isotope composition of its teeth. These characteristics are not found anywhere else among the even-toed ungulates, but are found in whales. There you go, easy peasy.
According to scientists, although Indohyus, as it is known, looks nothing like the whales of today, it shares certain anatomical features.
Like the ones I just mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a mouse deer. It's nothing like a whale.
You do know that evolution is all about change, right? Like, yeah, we say that whales are ungulates. One of the characteristics of ungulates is that they have hooves. Do whales have hooves? No. But when you trace their lineage back through time, you find these little mouse deer things that do have hooves and are obviously even-toed ungulates, but also have characteristics that are unique to cetaceans. Ergo, these little mouse deer are part of the lineage that eventually led to modern cetaceans. Now, as we have seen, people have been suggesting based on other characteristics for centuries, like literally multiple hundreds of years, that whales are ungulates. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, fossil evidence started to emerge that supported this. Are you saying that God made a specific class of artiodactyl mammals that would be buried in the flood at just the right rock layer to make us think that they came right before all the other ancestors of whales and were slightly less aquatic than the other ancestors of whales, and shared characteristics that are unique to cetaceans but were clearly artiodactyls and not cetaceans? Why would God want to trick us in such a way?
Couldn't it just as easily be said that anything is related to the whale?
No, because not just anything has the characteristics that you completely ignored that point us in the direction of them being related to the whale. It looks like you read the summary of a popular science article, then skipped the first 5 paragraphs of the article to get to the quote that you thought was damning, and then didn't read anything after the quote. Once again, you are demonstrating that creationists, in order to make their points, have to completely ignore and misrepresent huge chunks of the evidence for evolution. I didn't even have to go past the article that you cited as a source to demonstrate that you are wrong, and the only reason I did is because I apparently care more about the truth than creationists do, and yet they claim to have the ultimate source of truth on their side.
Exactly.
Oh, well, thanks for agreeing with me. There you go. Creationism is done, folks. I can shut down my channel now.
The Wisson actually admits that these anatomical features are in fact shared with other creatures.
Oh, you're not done. Fuck.
He says all of these characters are found in some mammals unrelated to cetaceans or whales.
Oh my god, you absolute numpty. You actually went to the original paper and you still came out without figuring out which features made Indohyus special. Okay, so going to the study, they do indeed say that. In the section where they are discussing whether the Indohyus find should cause a redefinition of what it means to be part of the clade cetacean. Up until Indohyus, cetaceans were identified mainly by the presence of the involucrum in the ear, because no animal had ever been found with the involucrum that was not a cetacean. But with Indohyus, which is clearly an artiodactyl, we now have something that is not necessarily a cetacean, but which has the involucrum in its ear. So either the definition of the clade cetacean needs to change, or else it becomes a paraphyletic group instead of a monophyletic group. Brief refresher, a monophyletic group is a grouping of organisms by a characteristic that is shared by all descendants in that group, so for instance all vertebrates have vertebrae. A paraphyletic group is a grouping by characteristics which are not necessarily shared by all the descendants of the common ancestor. So for instance the word wasp. Everything that we would call a wasp shares a common ancestor, but there are descendants of that ancestor in the same monophyletic grouping as wasps, the Hymenoptera, that we would not call wasps, like ants and bees. So the word wasp is a polyphyletic term, whereas the Hymenoptera is monophyletic. So they were discussing in that section which characteristics we should use to define cetacean, and though several phylogenies that they constructed showed great parsimony with some characteristics, these characteristics are not exclusive to cetaceans. They then go on, in the very next sentence right after the one that you quoted, to say, we attach particular importance to 2 character complexes that characterize basal cetaceans, constitute synapomorphic suites for the order, and are of great functional importance. Another refresher, a synapomorphic character is a characteristic that is present in an ancestral species and is exclusive to that species' descendants. They then go on to explain the 2 character complexes that they are using to define cetaceans, a certain structure in their teeth and the shape of the postorbital temporal region of the skull. And that comes literally right after your quote there. So once again, creationists have to completely misrepresent what is being said in order to make their point. Like, this is so egregious that it would be the equivalent of me pointing out that Jesus said in Matthew 5:38, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So Jesus supports the idea of personal retribution. But then if you go on to verse 39, where it goes into the whole turn the other cheek thing, that shows the first part to not quite be accurate when it's taken out of context all by itself.
What about vestigial organs?
Yeah, what about them? They are quite fascinating.
If evolution were true, and human beings are the current dominating species in a long line of evolutionary changes, starting with an ape-like ancestor, not only would we expect the fossil record to reflect that, but we would expect at least 2 other things as well. First, there should be human beings alive today in such transitional stages.
Okay, that was a bit of a mess. Now, for starters, humans are not necessarily the dominant species on the planet. I mean, it depends on what you mean by the word dominant. But let's just let that slide and move on to the there should be human beings alive today in such transitional stages. So, as you yourself pointed out when discussing horse evolution, evolution is not linear. There is no one end goal that all humans are evolving into. There's just a bunch of different mutations that arise that can lead to different traits, and several of them might exist simultaneously, and if the populations with those different traits are isolated from each other, then evolution can continue in different directions, etc. So with this in mind, we would expect to see variation among humans. And we do. The fact that I can tell you apart from other human beings means that there is variation. It's really that simple. But you were probably looking for more specific traits, like, for instance, if one group of people were extremely resistant to heart disease, like the people with the ApoA1 melano mutation. Or if one group of people were extremely resistant to broken bones and osteoporosis, like that family from Connecticut. Or if one group of people mutated to take advantage of a food source that was previously unavailable, like everyone who can drink milk as an adult, which is still a minority mutation. Most people in the world are lactose intolerant, and those that aren't have inherited one of about 3 or 4 mutations that arose independently about 10,000 years ago. 4,000 years before the universe began? So, yeah. We see lots of people alive today in such transitional stages. In fact, it could be argued that everyone alive today is in such a transitional stage. We just don't have any way of knowing which features or traits will be the ones that survive millions of years from now.
In other words, we should be able to examine the human population today and find human beings in the process of evolving into better, supposedly more fit creatures.
Yeah. Like developing lactose tolerance, super dense bones, and resistance to heart disease. Sure, we do see that.
In the process of growing wings or a fifth chamber in our heart or something.
Why would you expect humans to grow wings? And what would be the purpose of a fifth chamber in the heart? I mean, wings would be nice, but there's no selection pressure for it, so it's not really expected. And maybe an extra heart chamber would be helpful. I'm not a cardiologist, I don't know, but what reason do you have for expecting developments like these?
In fact, that was the main premise of the old comic book series X-Men. But we see no evidence of that happening.
Oh my God. Oh my God. You brought up X-Men unironically, as if that's what we should expect of human evolution. That's amazing. Thank you so much for the laugh, buddy. This has been a fun one. I needed that.
We don't see humans transitioning into growing wings, being able to walk through walls, or gaining super healing immune systems.
No, we don't. Because that's fiction. You do understand what the concept of fiction is, right? It's when a story is made up. Now, sometimes in fiction, they do make up stuff in such a way as to make it sound like it might be scientifically plausible. This is science fiction. So, X-Men were written in order to have a bunch of people with superpowers, and evolution was used as the explanation for those powers. No actual scientist would ever expect evolution to result in superpowers like that. Unless you count extra dense bones as a superpower. Well, maybe Dr. Jeff is a member of that family. At least, his skull does seem to be incredibly dense. Now, you see what I mean? I try not to do that, but I have a really hard time with this guy. Like, he brought up X-Men, unironically. And he almost killed me.
In fact, as the Earth continues to deteriorate, in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, we see the opposite occurring. More and more has to be done just to keep us alive as long due to the spreading of disease.
Yeah, clearly. That's why we all have to have 10 kids if we want 2 or 3 to survive into adulthood, right? Oh, wait. No, that's how it was in the past. Almost like you actually have it exactly backward. In fact, in a 2005 paper on historical longevity, life expectancy was 25 years during the Roman Empire, 33 years in the Middle Ages, and 55 years in the early 1900s. So our average life expectancy keeps going up, which is indicative of how we are deteriorating, and now it's harder than ever to keep us alive? All right, that's it for this one. It's been a fun one. That was a fun ride. But he just goes through a few vestigial organs next, points out that they do have some function or other, and then declares that they are now somehow not a vestige of our evolutionary history because they're not useless. And since uselessness is not a requirement for the label vestigial, it is entirely irrelevant. Also, I covered Kyle Butt making the exact same claims in an earlier video, so if you want details on that point, go check that video out. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the good vibes that get sent into the universe that is my channel. If you'd like to get all wooey up in here, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. And with apologies, I appear to have forgotten to thank my PayPal donors over the last couple weeks, so I apologize if you're in the group that I forgot, but I've got a little list here for you. So thank you to Catherine, Delian, Scott, Yannick, Ronald, Alexei, Thomas, and Candida. So thank you very much to those fine people for sending me money and helping me to, buy food and stuff. Yeah. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wish list, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!